day in and day out, while creating this persona to the everyday world that everything was fine and I was okay and everything about my life was all right, I was suffering 24/7. Taboo intrusive thoughts. So we're talking about pedophilia, incest, necrophilia, harm, intrusive thoughts. These themes are going to come with shame about the content, shame about the idea that you even had the thoughts. It's so important to be able to recognize that that is a significant part of the experience with taboo intrusive thoughts. You are going to have to deal with this shame separately, probably, or in conjunction with therapy. Practicing acceptance of OCD in general and understanding that that theme does not have to define your whole experience is also really important. OCD is going to convince you, everything that you read is going to convince you that you are different, that you are the exception. Your thoughts are too bad. Your feelings are too bad. The images are too bad. You can't come back from it. Yes, you can, because you're not coming back from anything. You're coming back from OCD, and it's really important to make that distinction. You're not coming back to, I crossed some line of being a horrible human. You're coming back from a disorder that's not your fault, that you didn't cause.
Today we're joined by Chrissie Hodges, a mental health advocate, peer support specialist, and co-founder of OCD Game Changers. Chrissie has been open about her journey with OCD, especially the isolation of taboo and intrusive thoughts. Her book, Pure OCD, The Invisible Side of Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, has helped countless people feel seen. There we go. And today she's here to share her story, break down stigma, and talk about the work she's been doing to support the OCD community, hopefully helping some of us feel a little bit less alone and to show that there is hope out there and progress and change can be made. Chrissie, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. I'm always happy to support NOCD's initiatives and advocacy. I'm just so glad to be here to help.
Awesome. We're going to kind of talk about a few different points, but I really wanted to start out with your personal OCD journey because I feel like as somebody with OCD myself, something that's very important to know and kind of hear is that like we're not alone, right? And I feel like you having so much experience in like peer support and everything, but also having gone through some of these things can be so helpful for people to hear and understand that like you are kind of living proof that you can live with OCD and have a successful life and be strong and kind of overcome some of these fears that feel so isolating and scary,
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I just kind of want to start off by asking you about when you first started to notice symptoms of OCD. I know you mentioned that it was in your childhood, but if you want to just walk us through some of the key moments of your journey, when your symptoms started, how they evolved, the struggles you faced, that would be awesome.
Yeah. I've had OCD for 40 years. It started for me when I was 8 years old. Really, it was the first onset of OCD, even though when I look back, even before that, I can see that I had obsessive qualities with, thoughts about harm and things like that. But really the first, kind of pinnacle onset was the fear of vomiting when I was 8. And that was accompanied by religious scrupulosity. And I don't really consider religious scrupulosity to be taboo, but I do in a way because the things that we make up in our head about religion and eternity and what that means, and am I a good or bad person, and am I being punished? So I definitely look at, I'd lived with this for 12 years. And I'll get into a little bit more about that, but it definitely was taboo having religious scrupulosity. I had all these false beliefs about what was a good and bad person and what I was putting into my mind and if I was going to be punished by God or if I was going to be possessed by the devil, things like that. So that really was, while I always say I had these big fears that were kind of the drivers of, the everyday lived experience, really what turned the cogs was the religious scrupulosity. I grew up in a really religious household. My dad was a Southern minister. And, I also had a lot of childhood trauma and neglect. emotional neglect. And so when OCD showed up at age 8, it really just took over my whole world. Everything about my life became managing what this big thing was that happened to me. The fear of vomiting consumed me, and then the compulsions of needing to pray and needing to do all of this religious stuff to neutralize it, or prove to God that I was a good person to take this stuff away. It was pretty debilitating. However, I did not live in a household where I, knew at a young age I could even express that to my parents. They either wouldn't believe me or would invalidate that. And I knew that as a young child. So I kept this all to myself. And so day in and day out, while, creating this persona to the everyday world that everything was fine and I was okay and everything about my life was all right, I was suffering 24/7. I don't even remember having a childhood or an adolescence. I mean, it was just like, when I look back, I just think about how, what was taken from me. And that every single day was kind of a fight until the next day, hoping that this would go away. And so I didn't know what it was. This was back in the 80s. And, again, didn't have any support. And so really needed to, sorry about that light. I really had to do this alone. And I was battling in my mind every single day with God, or whatever I assumed God was at that point. And so, I got to a point where it was just day in and day out compulsions. And then, probably around puberty, when I just started developing and then hormones were coming up, I started to develop really strange intrusive thoughts. Demon possession was a big one for me, which I do consider to be taboo. I worried about that a lot. I was stupid and watched The Exorcist. So at night I would sit there and wait for my bed to start shaking and things like that. I was always monitoring. Again, everything coming back to religious scrupulosity. I assumed that I had been doing something wrong and God was punishing me. Mm-hmm. I'd have incestual intrusive thoughts that then, and so when the sexual intrusive thoughts started to come out, that was really troubling to me. I grew up also in a household that did not view sex positively. We did not talk about it. It was wrong. It was sinful, all of that. And so to even have intrusive thoughts that involve sex were just, it was distressing to me. And again, to have these, not be able to talk about it and assume that I had done something wrong and God was punishing me. I mean, for those of you that live with OCD now and you have Google, you might be going, well, that's weird. Why didn't you just Google it? We did not have Google back then. And there was no way I was going to come out to my religious family and say, I'm having thoughts about demon possession. I worry about vomiting every day. I worry that I want to have sex with my family members, or that I'm going to harm or have sex with our cat or dog. This is not something that you would just come out and tell, because there was no idea in my head that there would be a remedy other than I am a horrible person. I have done something wrong, and this is a punishment for me.
Yeah. And so a lot of times with thoughts like these, especially if you don't know that you have OCD, now we know that these thoughts attack things that you value most, right? So it's not like a true reflection of things that you actually want to do or act out on. But back then, when you didn't understand that these thoughts were OCD, how did they make you feel as a person? Were you afraid? What was kind of going through your head?
Well, again, I had made up a narrative in my head, which I think a lot of people do to justify the experience of OCD. I made up a narrative in my head that I knew was kind of nuts. I mean, I knew I wasn't psychotic, but it was ego dystonic, but in a way it was ego syntonic, because I had to make sense of what was going on. And the only way I knew how to make sense of that was that I was being punished by God. I mean, it sounds bonkers, but when you are desperate to need to justify something in your head, you will take just about anything if it provides some sort of comfort and relief from the daily grind of OCD. And those compulsive behaviors and almost compulsive hope of someday I will be good enough and God will release this from me. I mean, it was just like any sort of compulsion. It just provided that 1 inch of, okay, I'm going to be okay. But then, the next day would throw you back into the hell of it all. Also, at the probably the biggest one that hit me was sexual orientation OCD. Now, and I know that all of your viewers are going to think this, and I think this as well. I do not consider sexual orientation to be taboo, because I don't consider that to be wrong. Gay, straight, bi, any, asexual. I do not consider that taboo. However, considering the times, and again, if you didn't live in the time that I did, you're not going to understand this really. But considering the times, yes, being gay was considered wrong as a societal standard in the 80s and in the 90s. The strange thing about this is that even though I was being taught that, I did not think that in my brain. I mean, to me, I just thought, I don't care. Like, people can do whatever they do. I think when you deal with the type of suffering that we have dealt with, I mean, you look at, anything that could be oppressive to anybody, and you're like, oh my God, I have no tolerance for that. Like, let people be.
Yeah.
And so and that was also an interesting internal battle for me, because at the time, and again, we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, anyone around me would say being gay is wrong from a biblical standpoint. They just would. This is the environment that I was in. But in my mind, there was also this battle inside of me going, but I don't think it's wrong at all. And I can't express that either. So see, everything was secretive and everything was this. So basically anything authentic about me was being hidden. That's what it felt like. And so I had this public persona hiding all of this stuff going on. Sexual orientation OCD rocked my world. But also this other feeling of, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with being gay, because I identify as straight. And so I had sexual orientation toward being a lesbian. I did not think there was anything wrong with it. But then that also added to the cycle of, well, if you don't think there's anything wrong with it, maybe you're just in denial. Yeah. And so there were moments, well, there were several times where it would kind of ebb and flow and it wouldn't be in the forefront. And I would think to myself, like, this feels very similar to the fear of vomiting, to the fear of like wanting to have sex with my uncles or family members, and this is strange and it doesn't feel, so there were moments of ego dystonic, kind of clarity. But then once you're in the cycle, it doesn't matter. And again, there was no way out for me. There was no, I'm going to tell someone. I couldn't tell like the preacher, because then they would think, that, well, I just assumed they would think that I was in the closet, which I know I wasn't, but I was like, well, then, what if I have to come out of the closet, but I'm not even in the closet? It was very strange.
Yeah.
But I would say the deeper that you get into any theme, the more themes are going to come in. So then I started having intrusive thoughts about pedophilia. I started having harm thoughts, things like that. And so I do feel like the longer you go untreated, sometimes like the darker things get, because you're just reaching more to try to figure out, is this real or not? And of course, OCD, as I said in the video with Patrick last week, OCD just raises the bar. You think you're getting closer to finding a solution, and OCD is like, oh yeah, now we're going deeper. And so we're going to raise this even higher. And so I lived with all of this, with religious scrupulosity looming over me, punishing me day in and day out until I was 20. Had a tragic incident happen in my family where someone died, and I just broke. But silence was my vow to myself. And so I didn't tell anybody, and I attempted suicide at 20. And I was hospitalized, and luckily in 1997 in a random mental health lock facility in Atlanta, Georgia, they were like, we think this is OCD. But they were baffled too. They'd never seen anything like it either, which was not helpful. Yeah. But, I got on medication. I was lucky that medication probably, symptom reduction, 95%. Then a year later, I got off the medication because of the side effects. I just didn't want to be on it, and relapsed severely. And that's when I was lucky, and through AOL dial-up, I found Dr. Stephen Phillipson. He was the only thing I'd ever seen ever on what we call Pure OCD, which is a community name. And he had article after article of people that experienced all the taboo intrusive thoughts, religious scrupulosity, and sexual orientation. I was like, oh my God, this is a real thing. And I was fortunate enough to get treatment. and to be able to move into that symptom recovery.
Yeah. And when you first started the medication, it was just medication, right? Not like ERP therapy or anything.
Oh no, there was, I mean, no one even really knew about ERP therapy
Yeah.
back then. It was medication. And, you know, I went to therapy, talk therapy, of course, just as like this maintenance that let's just make sure she's okay.
Hmm.
And every therapist that I told didn't believe that it was OCD and would basically be like, well, it sounds like you're just struggling with your sexuality and, you know, that you just have an unhealthy relationship with religion. And I just was like, you know, and of course you hear that. And even with a diagnosis, and
Yeah.
even though the medication is working, it's still triggering because you go, well, this is the professional. Maybe the other professional got it wrong. So I just eventually stopped going because it wasn't helpful. It was just sitting in front of someone who, you know, I perpetually started to believe didn't believe me,
Yeah.
which I mean, I hardly believe myself half the time.
Yeah.
So having a professional validate that was just, it was just not serving me. And so I stopped.
Yeah. And then how did that discovery of like what pure OCD is, that it exists, that there's this whole community, what did that kind of mean to you when it kind of clicked for you that, oh, this might be something I'm experiencing?
When I found out about the, you know, community name Pure OCD, I mean, just like when I was diagnosed with OCD, there was a weight that was lifted off. Mainly it made me feel like, oh my God, I'm not going crazy, because OCD makes you feel like you're going crazy. And so to see that there was a name for it, that there was treatment for it, you know, on one level, there was so much relief. On the other level, oh my God, there's other people out there. But then the third level, which is what I operate off of and what OCD operates off of, is I'm the only one that doesn't have this. You know,
Mhm.
everybody else has it. I meet all the criteria, but I'm going to be the one that they discover doesn't have OCD, and treatment
Yeah.
isn't going to work. And I'm not going to do the treatment because I'm going to find out I'm just in denial, you know, or I am a bad person in the eyes of religion, yada, yada, yada. And that, you know, that did feel risky. I will say just my like high propensity to want to kill myself because of the depression was the driving force of like, I will do anything to get better at this point. I have nothing to lose. And so, you know, Phillipson took that and ran. He was like, okay, well, let's go. So starting ERP, you know, and I think back, this is 20 something years ago. I think back, and this happens, I think, to a lot of people, is when they go through therapy the first time, it is like white knuckling. I want to get better. Please let me get better. And then after therapy, you get better. And then you go for a significant amount of time and you forget just how bad it can get. And
Mhm.
B, you forget how hard it is to get better because you got to take the risk. Um, you got to take the risk in doing the therapy to get better. And so I forgot that, you know, I think back on therapy now and I think, oh, it was just a couple weeks and then I was better. That is not true. And Phillipson would confirm that it wasn't. It was weeks and weeks and weeks. It was agony. It was me, you know, every single week going, is this going to work? I'm so scared, you know, and eventually it did work. And then all of a sudden it switches out of that fight flight into
Mhm.
logical brain. And it's like, oh, I'll never struggle again, which is not true. I have struggled immensely since then with any and every thought under the sun, harm, sexual intrusive thoughts, you know, real event, everything.
Yeah. And for somebody that's in a position where they're like kind of nervous to try therapy because it can be scary, like you're saying, it can be a lot on somebody. What would you kind of say to them to help them feel like it can be worth it? And even though there's no technical cure for OCD, that you can have tools that help you deal with your intrusive thoughts and that things can get better. Like, how would you kind of motivate somebody to realize that therapy, while scary, can be extremely beneficial?
Well, this is what when I'm supporting someone through peer support, this is the stage that most people are in when I'm supporting
Mhm.
them. So in motivational interviewing, we call this contemplation, right? Contemplation of therapy, but there's so many factors of why not to do it.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I try to do is just reiterate what almost every single person's experience is with OCD. And I know I just said that, and then someone's going to say, well, that wasn't my experience, so I know I don't have OCD. But like, just to generalize, people are scared of therapy. You may have motivation, you may not have motivation, but people are scared. There are all kinds of fears that come up with therapy. What if this proves I don't have OCD? What if the therapist doesn't believe me? What if I do the therapy and I realize that all of these were true and I was just in denial? These are all part of the cycle of OCD. This is, again, how Patrick and I described raising the bar. A couple of things that I like to share with people: with taboo intrusive thoughts, you're just going to have added layers of shame and guilt. This is just standard. This is why I can't stand it when people say that the themes are all the same, because it's absolute bullshit. Taboo intrusive thoughts. So we're talking about pedophilia, incest, necrophilia, harm, intrusive thoughts, real event, things like that. These themes are going to come with shame about the content, shame about the idea that you even had the thoughts, shame about images, shame about checking, and then I brought these on myself. That must mean I'm acting on them, or I wanted them. Shame across the board. And so it's so important to be able to recognize that that is a significant part of the experience with taboo intrusive thoughts. You are going to have to deal with this shame separately, probably, or in conjunction with therapy. There's research out there to back this up, that has come out in the last few years, especially around taboo intrusive thoughts. Work with your therapist on shame reduction. They don't necessarily have a step-by-step on how to deal with shame, but being able to have that shame validated. And for me, being able to meet other people that live with these thoughts, that day in and day out, either they're struggling with it or they've been through it and they're okay. When you see someone else's face and you hear them talk and you see that they're a normal everyday person walking out in the world and they have these terrifying intrusive thoughts too, you have compassion for them. And eventually that compassion will come back, and you're able to cultivate self-compassion, which is exactly what you need to be motivated to get therapy.
Yeah. And then touching on these taboo thoughts a little bit more, and the topic of shame, when you were dealing with your own battles with OCD, did you experience, did shame ever hold you back from discussing things that were really bothering you? And if so, do you have an example of that?
So, shame has been my constant companion, I'd say, since day one. And even though some of my intrusive thoughts weren't shameful, other than the religious scrupulosity, which again, I consider to be taboo, that there was an added layer of shame with the religious scrupulosity that I cannot even touch, and probably still haven't even processed to begin with, because in my family, religion is so entrenched generationally. I'm no longer religious, and not because of OCD, but just, in-depth exploration of like what I want versus what my brain says I have to do. So the shame that came along with that, which is very similar to taboo intrusive thoughts, is this: I am an inherently bad person. There's something inherently wrong with me. So the shame around that, because if you can't stop thoughts that don't align with who you are or who you think you are, which is what we call being ego dystonic. If you can't stop them and they continue, then you're going to turn that into yourself and say, then there must be something wrong with me. If I can figure out what's wrong with me, I can stop this. And so now, it's the snake chasing its tail, right? And so you can't, or the dog chasing his tail. I think the saying is the snake eats its tail. Anyway, whatever, something's chasing its tail. And, so now you're just chasing an answer that's just not there. And so many people for years and years and years live with this inherent fear that something's wrong, that there's some sort of deviant, that there's something bad about them. And if they can just correct it, or if they can get enough reassurance, or if they can confess everything and have a loved one say that's not who you are, that's going to be enough. And so for me, with religious scrupulosity, that was the bigger thing. For my other intrusive thoughts, like especially the ones with like vomit or sexual orientation, there was not a lot of shame around the content, but there was shame around, am I a stupid idiot? That I can't, I can't just reconcile this in my brain, that I live this dual double life from everybody else, that nobody knows who I really am in real life. While everybody is living their normal life, I'm sitting over here like managing all this bullshit while trying to show everybody that I'm just as normal as them. So there was a lot of shame about my authenticity, and that there was a lot of shame around, feeling like I didn't get to live the life that everybody else gets to. The milestones were just completely, demolished by OCD, things like that.
Yeah.
I think that eventually, I mean, this is going to sound, bleak, but this doesn't have to be the experience for everybody listening. But there were not resources for me until I was in my later 30s, right? Later 30s into my 40s. You look at the internet now, and oh my gosh, there's all kinds of accounts. When I started my YouTube, there was no YouTube channels about this kind of stuff. None. I was one of the first. And so you look at it now though, and you think there's all this content, there's all of this. There was not any of that until like 8-10 years ago. There just wasn't. And so it really wasn't until the last 8 to 10 years when I developed a community, when I started doing peer support. So I was able to meet people. I meet them in person because we do in-person events, that really the shame, is next to none now, because I know that I'm not alone, and I know that this is not my fault. And I know that by listening to other people's stories that are exactly like mine. And so if I can see that those people have worth and I can have compassion for them, then I can, I can give that to myself too. It's hard because self-compassion is hard, but I have to daily practice that. I am no different than anyone else with OCD, and they are no different than me. And we all deserve self-compassion, and we don't deserve to be saturated in shame, no matter the content of the fears.
Yeah. I do want to touch really quickly on some of the other types of taboo intrusive thoughts. Would you mind just explaining to me some of the other themes that you see come up with taboo intrusive thoughts, and just kind of like in your role as doing peer support and providing that peer support, how do you help people with these thoughts kind of come out of that shell of shame as we discussed and being able to talk about it to others?
Yes, great question, and something that I think is really important. I'm really passionate about talking about taboo intrusive thoughts because not a lot of people will.
Yeah.
And, I guess I can understand to some degree, not really, because OCD is OCD. And so when we start censoring ourselves on, the content, then we're basically sending the message to other people that they should feel shame about their intrusive thoughts. And I just do not believe that. So I'm super open. Most of my videos revolve around taboo intrusive thoughts on YouTube. And I just think it's so important that we're not isolating that section of OCD as this is just different. Y'all need a different degree of treatment, because that's just bullshit. Taboo intrusive thoughts in general, I mean, I see this the most for people. And a lot of it is because people identify with my videos and they feel less alone. So pedophilia theme is probably the one that I see the most. In fact, I run 2 POCD groups, and they always fill up. There's always a need for it because people with POCD really just need to meet other people. Because when we look at the word pedophilia, we look at the word incest, bestiality, some of these, some of the main intrusive thought or OCD themes that I see as far as taboo, the words in themselves are inflammatory, right? I mean, so much so that you have to be careful when you're putting stuff on social media, or they'll get flagged and censored, right? So if the word is inflammatory, imagine what the person's experience is like. I mean, we're taught from day one being a pedophile is wrong and bad, and rightfully so. We should be taught that, right? But even hearing the word, people have a visceral reaction to it. And so when people are having OCD and it is about this, it is shocking to them. Majority of people that have this, well, every person that has this, they say, I'm going to have to plug my computer in, by the way.
Okay,
So I'm going to have to walk and talk. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Everybody that I meet with that has this, of course is going to say the last thing I would ever do is harm a child. And I've never even, I've never had an inkling about it. I've never wanted to have it. None of that. And so to have these thoughts and to have them images and they're beating you up against the head all day, every day, it is terrifying for people. Terrifying. Because it's just so vastly against anything that they'd ever want. Same with incest intrusive thoughts, right? People have sexual intrusive thoughts or harm intrusive thoughts about their family. And it is so vastly against anything in their character, which is then even more isolating, especially with incest intrusive thoughts. Not that, especially like it doesn't matter with any of the others, but those typically your family, if you're lucky, are people you can confide in and get support. So if you're having incest intrusive thoughts or harm intrusive thoughts against your family, now that line of communication and support is taken away.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't really want to go to your mom and be like, by the way, I worry about wanting to have sex with you every day. I mean,
Yeah.
it's shameful and it's scary to even talk to about out loud. So I think the message that I always want to send is, you think you're alone in this, and you think that the content of your themes has something to do with who you are in this dark, deep place inside of you. And it does not. I've had both. I've had pedophilia theme, I've had incest theme, and I've also had the fear of vomit, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the fear of vomit has its a whole other set of annoying, horrible things. But I will tell you that it is different, and meaning like the shame. So you're
Yeah.
going to have more shame with taboo intrusive thoughts. However, if I have the fear of a taboo intrusive thought, and then all of a sudden I think I'm getting a stomach virus, that will take over just like that. And the panic around it and the need to know is just the same.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I can make the connection of, yes, this is OCD, right? And so, not that I hope that other people have different themes, but sometimes it's important to see that OCD is how your brain works, instead of this theme has to define my entire experience of OCD. Now, we need support on the different themes. We need to know that other people have them and that you're not alone, but you also like practicing acceptance of OCD in general, and understanding that theme does not have to define your whole experience is also really important. And a good way to do that, meet other people. Talk to people about the experience, because once you see your experience and other people's experience, you start to realize this isn't something that's inherently bad. This is a disorder, and I can get help and I can get better.
Yeah. Um, would you be able to share some of the specific, like, taboo intrusive thoughts that you had in terms of like incestual thoughts and pedophilia OCD? I just feel like, and you don't have to if you're not comfortable, but I feel like these are things that, like, just like seeing someone actually say them and can really help other people feel like less alone. But up to you completely.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, of course. So probably my first taboo intrusive thoughts were bestiality, and then harm intrusive thoughts towards my pets. And I still have harm intrusive thoughts towards my pets, by the way. I have two French bulldogs. And I mean, I was up last night actually just with images that kept hitting me over and over and over and stuff like that. But my first sexual intrusive thoughts were about my cat when I was younger. And I remember at that point I was simultaneously having sexual orientation OCD, and I'd started experiencing the groinal. So this is where your physical body starts to react to intrusive thoughts. So I was feeling like arousal non-concordant. So I was having movement in my groin, things like that. And so my first sexual intrusive thoughts were about my cat, and that was very distressing. It was very bizarre, and I do remember thinking like, how is this like going to anything and everything at this point? But because I love my cat and I knew that I would never do anything, to hurt it, it just was like all of a sudden there was this need to get the cat as far away from me as possible. I was scared to pet the cat. I'd get a groinal every time I would come near the cat, things like that. And so that was distressing. Incest intrusive thoughts, I've had those since, gosh, day one. And a lot of those manifest in dreams. And so I'll have sexual dreams about family members. And, before I knew that it was OCD, of course I would say to myself, I'm having dreams about this. So this means it's real. This is my unconscious mind coming to the surface when I dream. Um, And then, of course, after getting treatment and then realizing dreams are just another way to pull you into the cycle, um, that was at least easier to manage. I still, by the way, have dreams, sexual dreams all the time, about animals, family, sexuality, everything. Um, to the point where like I will wake up and be like, I may have had an orgasm, or like the dream actually feels, like I really wanted it in the dream. It feels like this was who my true self was. And that's very triggering to me until I just go, okay, I need to, use my tools on this. Pedophilia theme has been on and off for me through the years. Luckily, I feel like because I was able to get treatment for sexual orientation OCD, I haven't let the POCD get as deep into the cycle as like having it for months and months and months. But I will say the distressing nature of POCD, because it doesn't as much for me, it doesn't as much go into the content. So a lot of times it's images and it's physical sensations.
Mm-hmm.
So I might see an image and get a groinal, and then I'm terrified. What does that mean? And then, I start to see myself doing things like wanting to avoid social media, wanting to avoid anything on TV or going out or things like that, because I don't want to have that physical sensation. But it's less, even though I'll get triggered that way, a lot of it will go straight to what kind of person would even have these thoughts. And so that's what my OCD tends to focus on. And then there's this sense of doom of like, oh my God, I've now thought this, so it's never going to go away. I always have to reconcile that I even had the thought and the image. And so I'll never be able to live life again as like a pure person, as if I was pure before. But you know what I mean? Like there's just this weird thought pattern that's like, now you are screwed for life because you thought this when you saw that photo, or you thought this when you saw that kid. So that doom and despair is big. And then also, and this isn't mentioned a lot, I've also had pedophilia themed OCD projected onto a loved one. So I got into a cycle of believing that my partner at that time, it was way back, was a pedophile. And so now I'm starting to do compulsions around trying to figure out, is this person a pedophile or not? And that was terrifying too, because of course I can't tell that person or ask that person, by the way, are you a pedophile? And I knew that it was OCD, but because the feelings were so strong, and then of course I'm looking for facts, and of course you can find any sort of facts that you want or proof when you're
Yeah.
looking for it. That was pretty terrifying. So, but those are just, I've had necrophilia, I've intrusive thoughts, I've had filicide intrusive thoughts, even though I'm not a parent. Like I've even had intrusive thoughts about that, about what if I was a parent, or like reading stories about people that do things like that and then feeling the groinal to them.
Mm-hmm.
So feeling like I'm aroused when I'm reading other people's stories that are horrific, and then of course harm intrusive thoughts considered taboo. And I mean, I still have harm intrusive thoughts to this day. Like I said, I had them last night. I was up to like 2 a.m. just with images of things happening to my dogs in my head.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are just a few examples, but it's pretty much run the gamut. The darker the thought, I've probably had it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those. I feel like it's going to be super helpful. And even just in my other conversations, like you said, I know sometimes it's hard to talk about these and sometimes people don't want to, and I can understand why, but I think that you talking about them is awesome and really helpful for a lot of people. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. I just really want people to know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
OCD is going to convince you, everything that you read is going to convince you that you are different, that you are the exception. Your thoughts are too bad. Your feelings are too bad. The images are too bad. You can't come back from it. Yes, you can. You can come, because you're not coming back from anything. You're coming back from OCD, and it's really important to make that distinction. You're not coming back to, I crossed some line of being a horrible human, or some sort of deviant. You're coming back from a disorder that's not your fault, that you didn't cause. And there are pathways to do that. And there are people like myself and my community that will walk alongside you as you are getting back to who you are, and you realize this is just a disorder and not who you are inherently.
Yeah. And I think that's honestly the perfect note to end this on. Um, Thank you so much
You're
for all
welcome.
of your insight on that. This is really like we're trying to help reduce the stigma around this condition. And I think this conversation will really help people feel less alone and feel heard and seen. And we can't thank you enough for that. So thanks for the time that you put into this.